Hello and welcome. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. May Allah Almighty's divine peace, light, and endless favors be with you. The topic of this video is Sufism. What is Sufism? Sufism is a topic that is perhaps universally misunderstood. Not only is Sufism often misunderstood by non-Muslims, it is almost universally misunderstood by Muslims themselves. And in this training video, I'd like to shed some light on Sufism. This is actually a very important topic. It's essential to address the topic of Sufism because Sufism is essential to Islam. A proper understanding of Sufism leads to a proper understanding of Islam. And understanding Sufism now, in this day and age, is of particular importance. In fact, Sufism can very well be a key to many of the world's current problems. That'll be more clear as you watch this video, and I'll address it a little bit more fully later on. In this video, first I'd like to cover the etymological roots of the word Sufism. The word Sufi, what does it mean, where did it originate from, and how did it come to be used? We'll also address the historical development of Sufism, how Sufism emerged and arose within the context of Islam and Islamic spirituality. We'll talk about its true meaning and purpose, and also how you can apply Sufism, or Tasawwuf as it is known in Arabic, in your life. Quite simply, Sufism equals spirituality, and I'll explain that a little bit more throughout this video. Sufism equals spirituality, which is the spirit, the essence within religion. While the word religion may be understood to connotate or denote the outer expression of the path, of the way of revelation, the form, its external manifestation, Sufism is the inner dimension. It's the spirituality. It's just a word that really points to the spiritual dimension, the inner dimension of religion. So throughout this video, I'll use the word religion to denote the form, the outer expression of the way, and Sufism or Tasawwuf or spirituality as the inner dimension, as the essence. You have the form, the outer, and you have the essence, the inner. By understanding spirituality, by understanding Sufism and applying it properly in your life, you can achieve and attain a balanced experience of religion, a balanced experience of spirituality. Not only will you be carrying a complete and balanced path, a complete and whole path, integrated, but religion will become applicable and relevant in your life and in the lives of others. Only when the inner dimension, when spirituality is honored, does religion become healing and purposeful. Does it become beneficial and filled with light? And thus does the way, the path, religion becomes spiritually fulfilling. And it leads us to a higher state of consciousness, a transcended state of consciousness, what ultimately leads to becoming free from fear, anger, jealousy, hatred, envy, all of the negative characteristics of the lower self. With an intelligent and balanced spirituality, you become healed, you become whole. As human beings, we're all wounded fundamentally in our core. It's part of life on earth. And through spirituality, you can transcend the suffering that plagues humanity. Through spirituality, you can heal your life. And the ultimate source of healing is the divine presence. It's Allah Almighty. And only through spirituality can we approach the divine presence of God. Also, through understanding, applying, and living spirituality, not only do you heal your life, your personal life and environment, but you contribute to healing the entire world, your family, your friends, your community, the world at large. The world is dying from a lack of spirituality. It's drowning in materialism. And this is taking place within religion as well as without religion. Simply being religious does not mean a human being is spiritual. In fact, religion without spirituality can often become the very antithesis of its purpose. Religion without spirituality, without its inner dimension, without its essence, without its soul, without its spirit, is literally empty. It's just a form. Yet through spirituality, we attain the true purpose of religion. Our religion becomes beneficial, becomes healing, it becomes purposeful, it becomes a source of light and goodness in the world. Each healed soul is a source of light and grace for others, for everyone around them, for your family, your community, the world itself. The danger of not understanding Sufism or spirituality and not applying spirituality to one's life is that we can fall into an imbalanced religious practice. Without spirituality, both life and religion become heavy and burdensome, a trial, a constant struggle. Life and religion without spirituality becomes a path of force and struggle. It is non-conducive to development. It is non-conducive to peace. It is non-conducive to evolution of consciousness. Life in religion without spirituality is literally uninspired, lacking spirit. It becomes a path dominated by the ego, by ego mind, ego consciousness. And without a proper understanding of Sufism and spirituality, we can easily fall victim to corrupted teachings, to corrupted paths, those which are harmful to you, to the self, to your soul and spirit, as well as to other human beings, as well as to all other life forms. And without spirituality, there's a progressive loss of purpose. We progressively lose purpose in our lives. Spirituality is a path that is continually ascending. It is continually taking us forward, higher and deeper. Yet without spirituality, without Sufism, without Tasawwuf, life becomes, and the path becomes, the way becomes lacking purpose. There is no progress, there is no movement. And without spirituality, by failing to adopt, to practice, to embrace, to honor spirituality in our lives and in our religion, religion becomes harmful rather than helpful. It becomes destructive rather than healing. Religion without spirituality is dominated by mind, dominated by ego, and that means it is dominated by fear and anger. Rather than give life, it then ends up taking life. Yet that is not its purpose, that is not its true purpose. Never was, especially in the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. And without a spiritual understanding, without a grasp of spirituality, we're literally unable to pass anything of benefit on to others or on to our children. True knowledge, true realization, true wisdom is in the heart, it's in the soul. And a way of the heart, spirituality is the way of the heart, is necessary to pass on wisdom, knowledge, true learning to others, to your own children. True knowledge comes from experience, real experience, and it is passed from heart to heart, not from books. Okay, so what are the etymological roots of the word Sufi? What does the word Sufi mean? Where does it come from? There are several different references given to the origin of the word Sufi or Sufism. The first is the Arabic word safa, which means purity. This is the goal of Sufism. It is the goal of spirituality, to attain purity, to become internally purified, cleaned, clear, translucent, transparent, so that nothing but the light of Allah exists and operates through us. When the ego is veiling our being, when the ego veils our lives, the light of the divine cannot shine through. But the purpose of Sufism is to again attain purity within. It's a path of purity. This is known in Islam as Tazkiyyah, and it is mentioned throughout the Quran and in the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. In fact, when the Prophet ﷺ first began teaching, sharing the message, the way, he initially called it Tazkiyyah. Not Islam, but Tazkiyyah, which means purification. Yet another root of the word Sufi is the word suf, which means wool in Arabic. Wool. And this comes from the dress of the original spiritual ascetics, the Zahirin, the spiritual warriors, who wore just a simple woolen cloak to symbolize, to signify non-attachment to the world, freedom from the world. The simple woolen garb of the original Sufis was a testament to the lack of luxury and excess in their lives, and to the fact that they adhered to the original way of the Prophet ﷺ, a path of minimalism, a balanced path that took what was necessary but never in excess. The third root for the word Sufi comes from the Ashab as-Sufa, the companions of the bench. Ashab as-Sufa, who were companions of the Prophet ﷺ, who sat outside his home, and their primary focus was spiritual development. This was an elite group of ascetics and spiritual seekers whose primary and total focus was spirituality, spiritual development, the attainment of enlightenment. And fourth, the Greek word Sophia, which means wisdom, which symbolizes knowledge and understanding, true knowledge, which is often characterized as wisdom. This is again the goal of the Sufi: true knowledge, true wisdom, true realization. Now let's talk for a minute about the historical developments of Sufism, of Tasawwuf. Early in the Islamic Empire spread rapidly, and this led to the development of Tasawwuf, of Sufism, as a acknowledged or recognized field of knowledge within Islam, primarily due to two main factors. Number one, the increase in wealth, the acquiring of great amounts of wealth within the Islamic empire, within the Muslim community. And number two, the formalization and canonization of religion. In the time of the Prophet ﷺ, religion, the way, was a living way. It was not formalized, it was not canonized, it was not institutionalized. The companions simply saw the Prophet and copied him, followed him, did what he did, and they were continually being corrected by the Prophet. Yet within the first couple of generations, it became necessary to preserve the teachings, the way, the formal understanding of the way, of the practices of the Prophet ﷺ. And so religion became canonized. Point number one, the wealth and success of the Muslim empire. The wealth and success of the Islamic expansion. Islam spread rapidly and like anything ever before or since. Within a single generation or two, the Islamic empire had reached from east to west. They had conquered much of the known world. And many of those who embraced Islam were learning Islam originally from the companions of the Prophet ﷺ. But within a couple of generations, that was no longer the case. As the Muslim community rapidly expanded, there became a loss of connection to the living way, to the Prophet ﷺ as well as to his companions. And with this loss of connection crept into the hearts of human beings a subtle love of the world, subtle loves of the world. And number two, concurrently the canonization, the formalization, the institutionalization of religion. Now, in order to preserve the teachings and the way, the practices of the Prophet ﷺ, this was necessary. But unfortunately, whenever there's a focus on form, on the external, there is a concurrent loss of essence, the internal. With the shift of focus onto form, there was the inevitable loss of the essence and of spirituality. And here we see in religion how piety became equated with the external. This is how piety became equated with prayer, with fasting, with charity, etc., with these external observances of the religion. This was not so in the time of the Prophet ﷺ. In fact, the Holy Prophet ﷺ consistently warned against equating piety with excessive observance of external forms. Again, in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, knowledge was not canonized. It was not institutionalized. It was not formalized. The companions of the Prophet ﷺ simply saw and did. They saw what the Prophet ﷺ was doing, and they followed him. They copied him. They sought to do what he was doing. They sought to emulate him directly. It was a living path with a living master. And the companions were continually being corrected by the Prophet ﷺ in very subtle ways. In the time of the Prophet ﷺ, divine peace and blessings be with him, the focus of the way, the focus of the path was never about the fine points of external observance. It was always about character and intent. The way of the Prophet ﷺ's focus was on character and intent. It was on spirituality and development. With the Prophet ﷺ, the main focus was always internal and spiritual. And of course, this is not to say that external observance is not important. It is. It's what gives expression. It's what gives life to the internal spiritual dimension. Yet the way must be balanced. The spiritual essence must be preserved, or all is lost. The form has no meaning, it has no purpose without its spiritual essence. Without spirituality, religion is dead. So with these two factors, the increase in wealth and the canonization, the structuring, the formalization of religion, spirituality, the essence of the way, became lost. It became hidden. And the pious and the sincere, they who were still connected to the living way of the Prophet ﷺ, began to withdraw. They began to withdraw from the world around them and to stay true, to stay steadfast to the original, complete way of the Prophet ﷺ. They were in the world, but not of the world. They were travelers, spiritual travelers, and their primary focus was eternity. Their focus was the cultivation of the state of Ihsan, Maqam al-Ihsan, which the Prophet ﷺ described as the goal of Islam, the goal of the Islamic spiritual path. These individuals were known to practice with great sincerity and with sharp insight. They began to develop a reputation of spiritual development. And they were spiritually connected directly to the Prophet ﷺ through living chains of transmission. Through living chains of transmission, they learned either directly from the Prophet ﷺ, or from a companion of the Prophet ﷺ, or from a companion of the companion, and they could trace their lineage directly back to the Prophet ﷺ. These individuals then came to be known by others as Sufis. Again, meaning that they possessed great wisdom, great insight, they were non-attached to the world, their primary focus was on purity and spirituality. Now it's important to note here that Sufism is not an identity. I'm going to repeat that. Sufism is not an identity. To identify with Sufism is actually counter to the very principles of Tasawwuf. To identify oneself as a Sufi is actually counter to the very purpose of Sufism itself. Identification with is just a form of augmenting the ego, the self. And the very goal of Sufism, the very goal of Tasawwuf is to become purified of the self, to transcend the self and all temporal identity. To identify with Sufism is in fact not practicing Sufism. Sufism, which is a path to transcend all illusion, all form. Identification and separation, differentiation, is based in ego. Identification with comes from the ego's need to differentiate and separate itself, to make itself special, to augment its sense of self, its identity in the world. And this then is actually not Sufism. It's in fact counter to the very principles of Sufism, of Tasawwuf. The original Sufis did not identify with that term or with that label. In fact, it was a word that was used to describe them by others. But it would have been counter. They could not have imagined, the early ones, to call themselves Sufis, to step forward and say, yes, I'm a Sufi. To say that I'm a Sufi is to say that I'm an enlightened being, that I'm a spiritually purified human being, the highest state of Islam, the highest type of Muslim. Identification with Sufism is actually a later development. This is something that happened later. The ego is continually seeking to augment itself. It's continually seeking subtle ways to preserve or augment its sense of self. And it does this through identification. Incredibly, the ego, the self, the mind self, will actually use the very path designed for its annihilation to preserve and perpetuate itself. And this shouldn't be surprising. This is what has happened in every religion in the world, including Islam. Now, what is Sufism? Based on what I've described thus far, you probably already have a pretty good idea of what Sufism is, of what Tasawwuf really is. But here we'll go into it into a little bit more detail. Sufism, spirituality, quite simply is Tazkiyyah, purification, self-purification. Again, Sufism or Tasawwuf is simply Tazkiyyah, Tazkiyyat an-nafs, the purification of the self. And Tazkiyyah is mentioned throughout the Quran and the teachings of the Prophet ﷺ. Again, the Prophet ﷺ originally referred to the way as Tazkiyyah. Originally, his teachings, his way was not called Islam. This was a term, this was a description that was given to it by Allah Almighty in the Quran much later. Later did Allah Azza wa Jal complete and perfect the path, the way, the religion, and call it al-Islam, as the path, as the means to Tazkiyyah, as the way to purification. And again, several synonyms are used often to describe this internal dimension of Islam, the spirituality of Islam. We have in English Sufism, in Arabic Tasawwuf, or Tazkiyyat an-nafs. And sometimes this internal dimension, this field of knowledge within Islam, is also referred to as al-Ihsan, the knowledge of spiritual excellence, which is the very goal and purpose of Islam. Another term that is often used synonymously with Sufism or Tasawwuf is Tariqa. Tariqa means the path. And Sharia, which is the external dimension of Islam, the external rules and regulations of the Islamic spiritual path of Islam, also means the way, but the wide way. Traditionally, historically referring the way to water, to life. Tariqa then is the inner path. It's focused and accelerated. It's the inner path within the greater path. Tariqa is the essence of the path, and it's the means of navigating the Sharia. So you have the external, the greater path, and within that, Tariqa, the inner path. Tariqa also implies the way to the Prophet ﷺ, and thus to the divine presence of Allah Almighty, the Creator, the eternal divine source. Tariqa, the way, emphasizes a living lineage, that can be traced directly back to the Prophet ﷺ himself. There must be this living chain of transmission, this chain of transmission of realized masters going from one to the other all the way back to the Prophet ﷺ. Because Tariqa, spirituality, is based on reality. It's based on experience, not theory, not concept, but reality. And this type of knowledge can only be passed from heart to heart. It is not a knowledge that can be passed in books or in words, but it is a living, real knowledge that is passed through the heart from a realized master to a student, to a disciple, to a murid. This is a divine light that flows from the divine presence of Allah Almighty to the heart of the Prophet ﷺ, to his companions, to their companions, and so on to this very day. And incredibly, with Sufism, with Tasawwuf, with Tariqa, to this day there are masters walking the planet and teachers and students who can trace their lineage directly back to the Prophet ﷺ in an unbroken chain of transmission. This is incredible, and it's a gift from Allah Almighty that this is available to us. Sufism is thus the internal, the inner dimension of Islam. You have the external, which is the form and the physical, and you have the internal, which is the spiritual, the essence. You cannot have one without the other. You cannot have one without the other. You cannot have just form without spirit, or spirit without form. You must have both in this world. Just like you, just like me, just like the human being is comprised of a form and a spirit within that form, so too must the way, religion, consist of its form and its soul, its essence, its spirit. Imam Malik, radiallahu anhu, one of the early scholars of Islam, one of the early great scholars of Islam who codified the way, one of the great 4 or 5 original schools of thought or original schools of practice known as madahib, said that if one practices Islam or Sharia without practicing Tasawwuf, he or she will corrupt their soul. And if they practice Tasawwuf without practicing Sharia, they will corrupt the way. Yet only by attaining, by practicing both, by honoring both dimensions of the path of Islam, can one attain to al-Haq, the truth. The balanced path, the balanced way, the balanced approach consists of honoring both dimensions, the outer and the inner. And within Islam you have these 2 major fields of knowledge: Sharia, which is the outer, and Tariqa, which is the inner. Thus, Sufism is simply the term that is used to describe the inner field of knowledge within Islam, the spirituality of Islam. Sufism is simply the cultivation of sincerity, of ikhlas, in the attainment ultimately of Maqam al-Ihsan, spiritual excellence. It is Tazkiyyah, Tazkiyyah to nafs, that leads a human being into piety, true piety, and humility, which is the essence of the way. Tasawwuf is the path of light and love. It's the path of spiritual excellence, the perfection of character, which is the way of the Prophet ﷺ, who said, "I was but sent to perfect noble character." While Sharia, religion, teaches how to pray with your body, Tasawwuf, Tariqa, teaches how to pray with your heart and soul. Spirituality teaches you how to surrender not just your body, but your soul, your mind and your soul. Again, we must have both. For religion without spirituality becomes hypocrisy. It becomes corrupted. And at worst, religion without spirituality, lacking compassion, lacking wisdom, lacking understanding, becomes evil. It becomes harmful and detrimental. It can thus become the antithesis of its very purpose, the very reason it was revealed, to help humanity to become healed, to become whole. And spirituality without religion ultimately becomes corrupted and lost. It cannot be preserved. Spirit requires a form to house it, to protect it, to preserve it. Spirituality without religion is a path without foundation. There's no way to pass it on. And spirituality without religion quickly goes astray. It quickly leads to error in the way, errors in the path. The way of the Holy Prophet ﷺ was the middle way, the balanced path. It was the straight path, never tending towards any extreme, either this way or that. Beginning and throughout the life and the teachings of the Prophet ﷺ, The emphasis was always on spirituality. It was always on character, on intent, on development, on piety, on humility, on sincerity. The Prophet ﷺ always emphasized spiritual purity, spiritual purification, human excellence. And the Sharia was designed to give housing, to give expression, to give form to this internal state of spiritual excellence. Unfortunately, it was not long after the time of the Prophet ﷺ, after about 3 or 4 generations, that this became upside down. This became reversed, and the emphasis shifted to form rather than spirit. The emphasis and focus shifted to the external rather than the internal. And so to this day, the emphasis still remains primarily on form. To this day, piety is equated with form, with external observance. And this is incorrect. This is in fact a grievous error. External observance does not equate to piety. External observance does not equate to piety. Intention must be pure. Intention must be pure. The Prophet ﷺ said, the value and benefit of an action is dependent upon the intention. And Imam Shafi, one of the other great schools of Islamic law and thought, the Imam of one of the great schools, said that this hadith alone constitutes 1/3 of all knowledge. We need only look to the example of Iblis, Shaitan, Satan, to understand this. He who excelled in external observance of worship, of all the forms of religion, yet failed internally, failed spiritually, and so went astray. Despite his excessive external observance of spirituality, of religion, of worship, he did not attain piety, humility. Instead, his worship became a source of arrogance and pride. And there is no place for self-righteousness within the way. The way of the Prophet ﷺ and the way of all prophets was always to cultivate sincerity and humility. And for the sincere and the humble, self-righteousness cannot be. There's an important statement of the Prophet ﷺ in which he describes the first 3 who will be thrown into the hellfire. The Prophet ﷺ describes 3 people that will be thrown into hellfire, and he describes them first as one who was a martyr, who died in the way of Allah, who sacrificed himself supposedly in service to Allah, in service to the way. Number 2, a wealthy person who gave a lot of wealth in charity. And number 3, a knowledge person, an alim, a scholar who taught and shared the religion. Yet on the Day of Judgment, when what is internal is revealed, when Allah exposes what was hidden within the breasts of human beings, it will be shown to this martyr, if he hadn't already realized it, that he didn't sacrifice himself for Allah. He sacrificed himself for himself, so he could be thought of as courageous, as victorious, etc. And the wealthy person didn't give his wealth to spend truly for Allah to help humanity, but rather gave it to be considered generous by others. And so with the scholar who taught not to heal and help human beings, but rather to be considered famous, knowledgeable, to be respected, to be adored by others. Even worse, to control and manipulate others with knowledge. A'udhu billah, may Allah protect us from such. Hypocrisy is worse than unbelief. Hypocrisy is worse than not believing, for it corrupts the way itself. It corrupts the way and veils it from those who are sincerely seeking the path. When those who claim to be following a path are in fact destroying it with their actions, with their lack of piety, with their lack of true sincerity, with their lack of spirituality, they are in fact making it impossible, if not at least very difficult for others to see the truth of the way. And this is worse than those who simply don't believe. Religion without spirituality is dangerous. It is driven by ego. It is motivated by the lower self and its passions, its anger, its greed, its hatred, its fear. Religion without spirituality results in arrogance and pride, in control and manipulation, in desire and in lust. Sufism is thus an intrinsic field of knowledge within Islam. There can be no Islam without tasawwuf. There can be no religion without its most vital component: spirituality, humility, piety, sincerity, purity. Sufism, tasawwuf, is not a fringe movement on the edges of Islam. It is not optional. Sufism, tasawwuf, tazkiyyah an-nafs is essential. It is vital. Spirituality and self-purification are absolutely necessary within religion, within Islam. There can be no form without its soul. And so one cannot call oneself a Sufi. Sufism, Tasawwuf, is incumbent upon each and every Muslim. Tazkiyyah is necessary for every human being. One would not or need not identify with Sufism just as they would not identify with any other field of knowledge, such as fiqh, tajweed, hadith, anything else. All of these fields of knowledge are essential for the believer. And in the time of the Prophet, again, it was a living way. None of these fields of knowledge were specialized, codified. This is something that happens as knowledge is developed. Thousands of years ago, an individual who was skilled and who excelled in healing others was known as a healer or as a doctor, as a medic. But now we have increasing specialization as knowledge expands, as knowledge develops. And this is by Allah's will that knowledge is continually developing. We're continually realizing more and more. So now we have heart specialists, ear, nose, and throat specialists, specialists for the digestive tract, etc. In the same way, there are some who specialize in fiqh, the external observance of Islam, in tajweed, the pronunciation of the Quran, or in tasawwuf, in tazkiyyah, self-purification. But these are all fields of knowledge which are essential. They constitute a whole. We cannot leave any out. And of all these fields of knowledge, the most vital, the most essential, the most important is the field of knowledge that deals with self-purification, with spirituality, the essence of the way. More than anything, it is important to be sincere, to be a mukhlis. And so, it is essential and incumbent upon every Muslim to practice Tazkiyyah, Sufism, Tasawwuf, Ihsan. The Prophet ﷺ, the Holy Messenger of Allah, said that a day will come when nothing will remain of Islam but its name, and many will recite the Quran but will not descend below their throats. And they will call themselves by this name, yani they will call themselves Muslim, yet they will be the furthest ones from it, from Islam. A day will come when there is nothing left of Islam but its name, and they will recite the Quran but it will not descend below their throats, yani it will not enter their hearts, it will be trapped in their heads, in the ego. And they will call themselves Muslims, but they will be the furthest from Islam. May Allah Almighty keep us on the straight path, the path of sincerity, the path of humility. May Allah Almighty keep us on the way of truth and continue ascending and progressing towards spiritual excellence, towards His divine holy presence. Both the inner and the outer are necessary and complement one another and create the whole, the balanced path. And just as a bird cannot fly with one wings, so too must a spiritual seeker, a Muslim, a believer, any human being embrace both an outer and the inner dimensions of the way. A bird with just one wing kind of just flaps around on the ground, and that's neither pretty nor dignified. Just as the bird requires those two wings to fly, so too do we require spirituality and religion to fly. So in conclusion, the label is not important and is actually counterproductive. There is no need to identify with Sufism or to stereotype anyone as a Sufi. Yes, there are many who identify with Sufism and who are not actually practicing Sufism in its perfection, just as there are many Muslims out there who identify with Islam and are clearly not practicing Islam. Identification with is just a form of egoism. The ego is constantly seeking to differentiate and separate itself. And the goal of Islam is unity. It's oneness. Allah Almighty says in Surah Al-Imran, "And hold fast all of you together to the rope of Allah and do not separate." Sufism is simply the internal dimension of Islam, the internal dimension of religion. It's the methodology that leads to sincerity, to piety, to humility, to spiritual excellence, and ultimately to awakening and enlightenment. There are 4 or 5 major schools of external knowledge, and there are 41 traditional Sufi paths, Sufi orders. Traditionally, one would follow any school of thought externally and any Tariqa internally, and these all lead to the same destination. Just as you have many universities teaching the same degrees, the same skills, you have many different paths all leading to the same goal, with their slight nuances, slight differences, yet all moving in the same direction back to the divine presence of Allah. Spirituality gives light and life to religion. And without spirituality, religion becomes enshrouded in darkness. It becomes lost in darkness. And it becomes the antithesis of its very purpose. Religion without spirituality, instead of healing and making whole, instead of moving towards unity of humanity, it then separates and divides. Instead of healing, it harms. Sufism is absolutely necessary, especially in the current age, where more than ever, a balanced understanding of Islam is necessary. It is Sufism, it is Tasawwuf, that is the way of the heart that leads to a higher state of consciousness, a transcendent state of consciousness, a shift from the ego mind to the heart, to heart-based consciousness. It is Tasawwuf, it's spirituality that leads beyond the ego mind, and thus to love and compassion. Continue to seek knowledge, seek truth, seek wisdom, seek understanding. The journey has just begun, and Islam is a journey. And Sharia and Tariqa are the way and the path. Visit my blog at ihsanalexander.com, where you'll find plenty of support material for your journey. Many tools and tips, resources for the spiritual path. Also, check out my premier program, the Islamic Meditation Program, at islamicmeditation.com, where you can get free and instant access to a complimentary mini course, as well as a meditation audio soundtrack. Simply plug in a pair of headphones, sit back, and relax. This is Ihsan, and I wish you divine blessings and light, strength, and support. May Allah Almighty's grace be with you, and may you be continually supported and led with light every step of the way to your divine and eternal success. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.